Well, welcome, welcome. Wonderful to have you all here tonight. Good evening, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, as I said, to the Cass Business School. I'm Marianne Lewis. I'm the dean here, and I'm truly delighted this evening to welcome Mark Wilson to give the dean's lecture. His title is Being a Good Ancestor, Looking Long-Term, Building a Sustainable Business and Creating Legacy. Mark is currently the Group Chief Executive of Aviva PLC. He has over 25 years of operational and executive experience in the insurance industry across life assurance, general insurance, and asset management in both mature and growth markets. Since he arrived at Aviva, Mark has set out a comprehensive strategy to turn around Aviva's performance, focusing the business on clear, simple financial metrics, invigorating the organization's culture, and serving Aviva's customers even better. Mark joined the board of Aviva in 2012 and went on to become Group Chief Executive in 2013. He has amassed extensive experience of leading major international insurance companies and has an excellent track record as a focused and inspirational leader. He was previously Chief Executive Officer and President of AIA Group Insurance based in Hong Kong, and before that he was CEO of AXA China and AXA Southeast Asia, also in insurance. He also held a number of senior management positions at National Mutual in New Zealand, where he progressed through many of the major business functions, gaining a deep and broad knowledge of the business. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Wilson.
Well, thank you, Marianne, and good evening, everyone. It's delighted to be here. I'm not an alumni of Cass Business School, but I wish I was. It certainly has a fine reputation, and I met Marianne last year, which is when I agreed to come and do this lecture with some remarks tonight. You know, I'm sure everyone's had a long, hard day studying if you're a student or maybe working hard, so I'd like you just to maybe sit back a little bit and relax and just imagine. And imagine maybe a spark. Perhaps there's a tired worker that's been working hard and he forgot to dampen down the oven, and the heat builds in the oven and a single spark flies out and it lands on a wooden table and becomes a flame that maybe flickers in the dark. And then the table catches light, and then the house catches a light, and the house is now ablaze, and it's cracking and it's popping. And the neighbours come outside wondering what's happening. And then they start panicking, and they do all they can. They fill buckets and create a human chain to try and, from the river with the water, to try and pass them down that chain to put out the fire. But of course it's woefully inadequate. And there's no proper fire brigade, so there's just a few hand pumps, but they're not working that effectively. And soon the fire becomes this rampaging thing going through every street and every square of the city. And it's got this somewhat sadistic life on its own. And houses catch light and they fall, and the next one falls, and it's like this unstoppable pyrotechnic dominoes that just keep on going in row after row. And you know, for 3 long days that fire consumes everything that's awake, and then eventually after 3 days it burns itself out. And then you've got all the people, and they're sort of forlornly searching through their possessions amongst the ashes of over 13,000 homes. And tens of thousands of those people are homeless. And they're huddled together in the shanty towns outside of the city. And thousands of businesses have gone up in smoke, literally. 86 churches to be exact. Public buildings, the very fabric of society, all gone. And yet all it took was that solitary spark. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about the spark on the night of 1 September 1666 in the bakery of one Master Thomas Fariner. It was on Pudding Lane near London Bridge. There's a monument in its place now. And ironically, Well, that spark, if you think back, that spark caused the Great Fire of London. And if you have a look at today's disasters and natural disasters, even then it was a disaster of an epic proportion. But ironically, it was that spark that also created the London that we know today. And even this venerable place of learning, that same spark actually ended up being the genesis of this place. Because as some of you may know that know the history of this wonderful business school, Sir John Cass made his fortune from the reconstruction of London. And he used that fortune to create a foundation which eventually, many years later, led to the creation of this business school. And out of that devastation also came another idea, an idea that was unknown at the time called fire insurance, and a service that was unknown at the time called a fire brigade. And that led to, there was a group of London merchants, 12 men, good and true, and I'm not being sexist there, it was all men that sat round, and they gathered at a place called Tom's Coffee House, where Charing Cross Station now stands, one afternoon in 1696, to be exact. It was Monday the 12th of November, 320 years ago, which is the genesis of the first Aviva company, and that's quite some heritage in itself. And over the coffee, they established a company that was our oldest ancestor company, a company that then was known as Hand in Hand, which is a nice brand name in its own right. Or to give it its full glorious title, I have to read this, I'm sorry, it's called the Contributors for Ensuring Houses, Chambers or Rooms from Loss by Fire by Amicable Contribution, PLC. And the decision they took led to the Aviva today, and indeed to me standing here. But as I stand here before you, I guess why should you listen to my prognostications and pontifications? And perhaps you shouldn't. Actually, that's something I asked myself quite a bit. And indeed, there were quite a few that thought that when I first became a CEO at age 28, because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And at times, I think all CEOs would feel that too. But so perhaps I should introduce myself. I see myself as some sort of mongrel cross between an architect, an engineer, and a businessman. A bit of all of those things. And I like to conceive and redesign and fix things so they're better than before. And I've built my entire career on fixing things, taking the biggest challenges, the most difficult jobs, the jobs that perhaps no one else wants, broken companies typically, and try and conceive what they could be and put them back together. And I've worked all over the world, from the Antipodes, where I was just about 10 days ago, to Asia, where I was for 14 years, and now Aviva, the last 3 years in Europe. And I've learned from everywhere I've worked, and I've learned from those visionaries who created the legacy like this business school, like Sir John, or perhaps from the 12 gentlemen who created Hand in Hand. But you put it all together, and I think what they left and what I try and do, it's all about being a good ancestor. And indeed, that is the title of my remarks this evening. So within that theme of being a good ancestor, I want to cover three main things. I want to cover where I see the world's going. I want to cover the role of business and the role of regulators, and indeed the role of a CEO. And I couldn't resist, given the timing, I couldn't resist saying a few words on a fourth somewhat topical issue, which of course is the EU referendum. But first, maybe a little bit of context of the way the world is going and the UK's place in the world. So I want you to look to the east. Think far to the east, to Norwich. Norwich Union, one of Aviva's biggest ancestor companies, it was founded in Norwich with a grand population of 210,000. But then imagine a different part of the world, a world way beyond Norwich, much further to the east, past Great Yarmouth, way, way, way to the east to Asia. So I'd ask you this, how culturally enlightened do you think you are, or I am? Do you have cultural or geographic biases in everything you do, or perhaps the language you use. Let me give you an example. Many people in this part of the world rather patronizingly refer to Asia as the Far East. It's not too far away from the Orient. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, I have news. To people living in Asia, it's not that far. Because Asia is now an economic powerhouse. It's at least the equal of Europe or indeed the US. You know, just for a bit of context, a few years ago I spoke to some business leaders in Sydney, and I asked them to think of the world as if Australia and Sydney were at its epicenter. They're Australian, that wasn't too hard, that's what all Australians think. And then I asked them to think of the whole hemisphere using Australia as its centre, a population of around 24 million people. And if you go south to the frozen wastelands of Antarctica, well, they're not wasteland, actually, they're rich in life, as we know, with a gargantuan permanent population of people of precisely zero, although in the summer it scales the dizzying heights of 4,500. Of course, we can't forget just to the northeast is that jewel-encrusted crown of New Zealand, home to one Rugby World Cup, and a colossal population of 4.4 million, and of course, quite a few sheep, 30 million of those wonderful woolly beasts. Let's fly north a bit, Indonesia, population 265 million and growing. North again to Singapore, the island state created by the vision of Lee Kuan Yew. Northeast to Hong Kong, where I lived for 14 years. Still a British territory, of course, to 1997. Malaysia, 31 million. The 7,107 islands of the Philippines. Total population 105 million. The beautiful kingdom of Thailand. A wonderful country, 68 million people. Vietnam still growing, 94 million people. China, the most populous nation on earth, 1.4 million people at last count. Still growing economically, but nowhere near at the same rate it was. Something I call the Shanghai sabbatical. Maybe we can pick that up later. Nonetheless, its nominal GDP still on course to surpass the US, to be the largest in the world by 2026, even at its current growth rates. And finally, India snapping at China's competitive heels with a total population of 1.3 billion souls. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at that entire hemisphere, that's 3.2 billion people, that's 40% of the world's entire population. And you know what? If you think about it, only 27 million of those people look like me with my Anglo-Saxon ancestry. So I'd ask you this, in 2016, where is the centre of the world? Where is the balance of power? I would suggest the East is not that far. And in my view, Europe has still not embraced Asia or some of the higher growth markets as it should. What about the other fast growing markets close to home? What about Turkey? What about Poland, where Aviva actually has two wonderful and large businesses? How much do we as a country really embrace them? I suggest not enough. Did you know that the UK exports more to each of the Netherlands, Ireland or Switzerland than it does to India or China? And I apologise for using a very technical British term, but to quote one of my directors, that's just plain bonkers. Now, this isn't some zero-sum game. It's not a case of the EU or Asia. We should be doing just as much business with Asian economies as we do with the EU. But the only topic we seem to want to debate here in the UK is the EU in or out. I don't think that is the only question we need to address, but I do agree it is a very, very important question. And I think it's worth just spending a question that's worth spending a few minutes on tonight. Now, my first question about the EU is a simple one. Should we be in or out? Now, on balance, I'm in. Think of it this way. If you're a passenger in a perfectly good large ship, on a stormy sea in the dark at night, and you're given the chance to change to a vessel, a much smaller boat, you don't know whether that smaller boat will be able to mount those towering waves and bring you in safely, or capsize and leave you perhaps at the mercy of the ocean's fury. Now, I don't think it's my place to tell anyone in the UK how to vote. And I've seen that when people bring facts into this debate, they're accused of scaremongering on both sides. And you may have guessed from my accent that I come from New Zealand, so I have no particular historical or emotional axe to grind. But I do think it is my responsibility to state some of the facts that people should consider when making an informed decision away from that plethora of emotional lobby groups that we see. And my first question is a simple one from looking in. What do we want the EU to do? We all seem to look at the EU now through an economic lens. But the fact is that it was set up to stop conflict and wars between member states, and it has been spectacularly successful in doing so, with the last 70 years being the most peaceful period in the entire turbulent history of the nations of the European Union. And I believe that must be at the forefront of our minds, particularly in this fractious geopolitical world with the enormous problems that we face. And the tragic events in Brussels show this all too clearly. Another question we clearly need to address: what would be the economic impact of the UK leaving? Now, Aviva manages about £350 billion of assets across the world. We have 33 million customers, 16 million of them in the UK alone. So we need a view. We need an economic view. And for me, the economic issues boil down simply to one of risk and uncertainty. And I see four main economic risks. One, there will be an impact of uncertainty on sentiment. Business sentiment, consumer sentiment, and market sentiment. And in the face of uncertainty, markets become volatile. They demand, obviously, a price for this risk. So what's the inevitable result? A fall in confidence, a fall in equities, a fall in the sterling. That these will fall, I think, is undeniable. The question is, for how long and how much? Second thing, economically, trade. I'm in favour of free trade. Putting up barriers to trade is usually a backward step. It's not only the tariffs and quotas, but the non-tariffs barriers from leaving a single market. It will slow trade here, and it will certainly hurt UK exports. Which leads me to three, lower growth. The net effect would be a real risk of prolonged lower growth. Not only would there be a short-term shock of exit, and PwC's independent report this week found it could have an impact of up to 100 billion in the short term. But even after that shock subsides, and it will subside, they forecast a long-term lower GDP that will be locked in. And that is certainly a view that our in-house economists share. PwC said 1.2 to 3.5% lower GDP in 2030. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but that's between 25 and 65 billion pounds wiped off the economy. That's more than the entire defence budget of the UK. And lastly, and importantly, from a business perspective, business perspective economically, that is, the impact of all this uncertainty in the City of London. The city is the gateway to the EU and the envy of other centres. That's one of the reasons I came here. I would ask, do we really want that gate to close? And if we had to renegotiate trade agreements with no guarantees, how long would it take for new agreements? 7 years, that's typical. Maybe a decade. Do we really want a decade of uncertainty? Because one thing I've found throughout my career is uncertainty is kryptonite to business. Markets hate uncertainty. But that's economics and business. What will it mean for people? People like our 16 million customers here. Well, if the economy grows less, it means people will be poorer, there will be fewer jobs, stock market falls, their pensions will be smaller. And I thought about giving you some sort of kind of figure and cumulative total of the impact of Brexit on a typical English family that is our customers. But the problem is there's too many unknowns, let alone unknown unknowns, and that's sort of the point. Is it worth the risk? But of course there is another side to this debate. There are many things about the way the EU works that I certainly would change. Would I like to see the EU become less bureaucratic? Of course I would. I have to deal with them. More competitive? Absolutely. More externally focused and pragmatic? Indeed I would. Some people would ask, is the EU even capable of change? And indeed that is also the right question. But I've got to say I'm cautiously optimistic. I see positive signs. Not only the Prime Minister's deal, which I think certainly puts competitiveness higher on the agenda, but also in the work already being done by Commissioner Lord Jonathan Hill from within the EU. In the past year, we've not only seen a slowdown in the flow of regulation, but he is now consulting on what regulations are too burdensome or are causing unintended consequences, and he's trying to get rid of some of that unwanted regulation. And we are starting to see a different tone in Europe, and certainly that is a tone I would encourage. So where does that all leave us? At the end of the day, I think this is a question for the people of the UK to determine. But I will say this, as an insurance company the size of Aviva, our entire business has been built on managing risk for 320 years. That's what we do. We are the risk experts. We take everyday risks and we pull them together so people and businesses and institutions and economies can function. We assess risks. We assess whether they're worth taking or they're not worth taking. So do we think leaving the EU is worth it? On balance, no. Because there is no insurance policy we can create against Brexit. It's not worth the risk. So that's the EU. But I want to take just a step back for a minute and go back directly to the title of my remarks, which is about being a good ancestor. See, I'm clear what it means. It's to have that maximum positive impact on the lives of our customers and our partners and society as a whole, not just now, but in the future. Making a profit is a byproduct, albeit a very, very important one, but it's a byproduct of that core activity. You see, financial profit is not a reason for being in itself. No business has ever survived long term with the objective of making money. It's not an objective, it's an outcome. Business does create financial profit, it's critical, it's necessary, but it also must create a social profit, a reason for being, if you will. And for me, it's about taking decisions that stack up in 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. And I've spent much of my career in developing emerging economies, and sometimes I've seen an unacceptable face of capitalism. But far more often I've seen the huge contribution business has made in lifting millions of people out of poverty. Business, I believe, is the greatest revolutionary force in history. In our own time, it's liberated hundreds of millions of people out of the shackles of poverty. If you take one example, China, between 1981 and 2010, China alone lifted 680 million people above the poverty line. That's more than the entire population of Latin America. That was to do with business and the success business has had. And business can continue to be this catalyst, this immense social and economic revolution, but only if we use it effectively, and we're not. Now take the UN Global Goals on Sustainable Development. I spoke at the launch of the goals at the UN General Assembly last September, and I set out how business can make them a reality. But most of the speeches at the General Assembly were about governments talking to governments about what governments can do. Governments have fine aspirations for the 150 billion or so of overseas development aid that they employ, which is basically what they were talking about. But if we have the global sustainable development goals to maximise their possible impact, we've got to mobilise the more than 300 trillion, that's US dollars, in the financial markets, and get it invested in resource efficient, sustainable technology, infrastructure and programs that will solve many of the world's problems. And at the moment, it's like we're trying to illuminate a stadium, maybe Twickenham, with a candle, when we have a $300 trillion set of floodlights that can make a big difference in this problem. We just have to work out a way to turn it on. Now, some people might quite cynically say, why would business really want to do that? And that's a good question. But I would have a simple answer for that. It's just good business, because if we don't act sustainably, if we can't make capitalism inclusive, then we're going to exhaust our resources and not meet our social purpose. And then society will turn against us. And we can see some of that now. And I believe if we don't get long-term thinking and being good ancestor and sustainability right, it will be the big daddy of all risks, and it will be the biggest contemporary market failure of all time. And it certainly won't make us good ancestors. I want to turn to the third of my topics, business, and in particular financial services. Now, if you read the papers and see the news, you'd think that the industry is full of either casino bankers on one hand, or grey men wearing grey suits and grey ties on the other. Either exceedingly irresponsible or exceedingly boring, take your pick. But there's a distinct whiff of snobbery in such caricatures. And when we look at it, how important the finance industry is to support homes and businesses and communities and countries, you realise how important it is to get it right. We have a social purpose. Now, I could trot out all the industry stats about the trillions of pounds that the industry manages, or the number of people we give pretty good jobs to, or the excellent returns and return on equity that we give our shareholders. It's all good stuff. But I want to do something maybe a little bit different. I want to look at a day in the life of Mr. Britain, and how many times a day the company like Aviva makes a difference in his life, even if he or she doesn't realise it. So let's call him, I don't know, Samuel Windsor, which I think is a delightfully British name. So Sam leaves home in the morning. There's our first three. You've got mortgage, protection insurance, building insurance and life cover. He locks his door to keep his most treasured possessions safe. That's contents insurance. 4, he takes public transport to work. Infrastructure, something we're huge investors in the UK. That's 5. Now, Sam runs his own business. We're the biggest UK SME insurer. That's 6. At lunch, he meets his medical consultant. He's got a sports injury. The meeting's through his private health cover. Another one, 7. He's also seen his GP. His GP is housed in the NHS. We're a major investor in the NHS infrastructure and buildings. That's 8. Sam comes home. He drives his 11-year-old daughter to Scouts. They've got a new hall with great facilities, part funded by one of the 360 awards that Aviva made from the Aviva Community Fund last year. That's 9. Motor insurance, of course, have to have that. 10. He takes his dog to the vet. Like most shaggy-haired sheepdogs, this one's called Boss. It's lovely. And like most dogs, it does some pretty interesting things. This one ate a plastic Darth Vader figurine and had to have an operation to remove it. Pet insurance, 11. It's the end of the day and Sam finally has time to plan his family holiday. Travel insurance, 12. But before he goes to bed, he goes online and checks his pension. We've got 1 in 4 pensions in the UK, 13. He also puts some cash each month into an ISA, a nest egg for when his daughter goes to Cass Business School. What's that, 14? You sort of get the point. There's 14 ways in which we can help Sam and his family sleep safe and sound. And ladies and gentlemen, if we didn't exist, someone would have to invent us, because stuff just wouldn't or couldn't happen. And I don't know about you, but I think those are pretty good reasons, 14 pretty good reasons, to get out of bed and go to work each day. But for all that to work, we must be financially strong. And my first duty as a CEO, my first duty is to make sure we remain in business for the long term. To do that, we must have the financial strength and good regulation we need to weather the shocks, like, of course, the 2008 global financial crisis. Now, plenty of people will say, perhaps some in this room will say, that financial services and banks brought it all on themselves and caused the crisis, and indeed that may be right. Some individuals and some companies, I won't name them here, behaved appallingly. They displayed an utter disregard for the risks they were taking and the long-term consequences of their actions. They completely lost sight of their customers. They were hardly good ancestors. They were thinking short-term, not long-term. But you know what? It wasn't just the banks or financial institutions that created this crisis. It was the regulators as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I want a robust, resilient, reliable regulator. I want my regulators to challenge me. I want my regulators to go after the bad guys. But the problem is it's human nature to try and put in small rules to correct big mistakes. And it's now gone too far. It's now what I call micro-regulation. And the problem with this approach is it just creates systemic problems, yet misses the big problems. In fact, one of the causes of the 2008 crisis was a collision of macroeconomics and micro-regulation. And it seems to me we've learnt the wrong lessons from the crisis. We've moved to a more structured, systemised vision of micro-regulation, when what we need is diversity and flexibility from regulators who focus mainly on the macro risks, not the micro risks. And in my view, the micro rules-based system in the UK regulation is flawed and it needs reform. And we're moving further and further away from the flexibility and diversity every single day. Now, there was a bloke called Charles Darwin. He understood this. The whole basis of his theory of evolution is that diversity ensures survival. And I mourn the fact that globally we're losing sight of Darwin's insight. And I also, while I'm at it, mourn the death of another old friend in this part of the world, one of the finest maxims of common law, caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. It's about making consumers and business both take responsibility for their actions. And we've moved a long way away from that. The way regulation's going in the UK is somewhat akin to the man who owns the goose that lays the golden egg, who's surprised when his goose has stopped laying those golden eggs because he's roasted it. So here's my recipe for regulators. And to somewhat mix my metaphors, perhaps it's like a football team. The governing body is like the government who sets the rules of the game and the spirit of which it's played. Perhaps not too much like FIFA, but we'll invent a new one. The referee and the linesman are like the regulators who make sure the players are playing by the rules. They're closer to the action and hopefully aren't waving their flags around too much. Businesses like mine, we're the players on the pitch. We play fair, we certainly should do, but we certainly play to win. But of course, all of us are actually playing for the spectators. They're the ones enjoying the game. They're the clients, customers, communities, societies, economies. who we are in business to serve. Now, the governing body and our referee and linesmen have a job to do. They have to make the right calls. I get that. But if they get too involved, they risk wrecking the game for the spectators. So it's up to us to help them make the right calls. So just to help them out a little bit, I've drawn up my short list of do's and don'ts for governments and regulators. 1, do establish and uphold the rule of law. Businesses won't win if it's the Wild West out there, and nor will our customers. 2, do step in decisively when markets fail. Make sure the right information is available so that when investors, they can make informed decisions with the widest possible assessment on the long term, financial, social, environmental and governance risks. 3, do encourage competition and then get the hell out of the way. It's okay, and in fact it's necessary for some businesses to fail, or else we don't have a system. Now my don'ts. 1, don't think your job is to eliminate risk. We should have an appetite for manageable risk. Assessing and mitigating and taking the right risks is something that gets taught here in the school. 2, don't change the rules again and again and again. As I said before, constant uncertainty is like kryptonite to business. 3, don't micromanage business. That's not your job. Regulation should not define us. You're the referee, don't try and be a player. No one wants the referee trying to score the winning goal. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. 4, don't chase cheap political stunts at our expense for short-term populist gain. And 5, don't, whatever you do, push business into short-termism, whether that's a requirement for quarterly reporting, and I'm delighted that requirement's been taken away from us in the UK, or using regulation to nudge us into short-term assets and so-called risk-free bonds or government bonds. I think we've found out they aren't so risk-free. Businesses like us should be in long-term balanced investments. And ladies and gentlemen, that is not where the global regulators are pushing us. Regulators, be forward-looking, not backward-looking. And I should say as well, as the FCA here in the UK prepares to welcome Andrew Bailey as the Chief Executive, I might add someone I have huge respect for, I look forward to dealing with a robust regulator that bluntly lets good business do good business. And that's a long way from where we are. So my final topic, and I guess I'm addressing this more to some of the students here, but when I talk to students, and I do so a little bit, I get asked a lot, what's it like to be a CEO, particularly at Aviva? What's it like to sit behind my desk, and how do I plan my day or even my year, and do those plans we make even work? I mean, how do you plan really when stuff happens, when markets go berserk, when politicians and regulators give you fiscal presence you certainly didn't want, when things blow you off course? Now, many of you would know Harold Macmillan, of course, British Prime Minister in I think, the 50s and 60s. And he was once asked by a journalist what blew him off course, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And I know exactly what he means. There was another great global statesman by the name of Mike Tyson. And Mr. Tyson was asked about plans, and he said, "Everyone has a plan to beat me until I punch them in the mouth." And I know what that means too, because all CEOs get punched in their metaphorical mouths at some stage. I've certainly been on the receiving end of some serious punches to the chops, not the least of which, as the Dean said, when I was CEO of the Asian financial giant AIA. Now, we were at ground zero when the global financial crisis hit and our parent company AIG collapsed. When you wake up in the morning, there's thousands of people literally queued outside every branch you have. In Singapore, the queue went for 10 consecutive blocks. I learned a lot from that experience. I learned that plans and rule books often don't work. There was nothing I could have learned probably at business school that prepared me for that. I've also learned that CEOs cast a long shadow, those off-the-cuff comments, those little asides you come out with and promptly forget. Before you've left the room, they can take on a life of their own. So I try, sometimes somewhat unsuccessfully, to choose my words with care. I think of the possible impact of saying something or not saying something. Sometimes it drives my PR team crazy. And what about other things like leisure? It's important, but let's be frank. If you're a CEO, you actually don't get whole days off, even when you're on holiday. How could you? Stuff is always happening and you're always in contact with your people. But I have zero sympathy for the CEOs, and I hear a few of us do this in the UK, that bemoan any of this because you can only do this job if you're committed and love it. It's not a hardship, it's a great privilege and it's a great responsibility. And if you love it, that's when you can actually do a good job. But nor are you in splendid isolation. You've got to get the right team around you to show their mettle when they're under fire. That's when you see who's good in your team and who isn't. Because the best teams are always forged in that adversity. Now I have a very simple leadership philosophy. Just hire the smartest people I can with the right value set. I hire intellect and values over experience any day. But a note of caution, of course, it's all very easy to get caught up in the intellectual arrogance and theory and complicated models that often bear absolutely no resemblance to reality, particularly in times of crisis. And I would agree, of course, with the famous words of Albert Einstein, who said that any intelligent fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a whole lot of courage to move in that other direction, to make the complex simple. Now, my role as a CEO is often to simplify and kill that complexity, to boil stuff down to simplicity and sort out the 3 or 4 or 5 things that absolutely must be addressed. I think you'll probably only make 5, maybe 6 big decisions a year. Maybe it's strategy, perhaps it's M&A, more likely it's about people. But if you want to be a good ancestor as a CEO, you've got to make the tough calls and popular calls. And if your desire as a CEO is to be loved rather than respected, then you'll fail. Because your decisions will be wrong based on your need for constant approval. In your organisation, you've got to set the business values you demand from your people, and we hire on those values. Our Aviva values are deliberately edgy and provocative. I was discussing with Marianne just before. It's a bit like being a good ancestor. So the first one's create legacy, which is being a good ancestor. The second one's care more, which basically means just do the right thing. The third one is kill complexity. As a business, as an industry, as a country, we love creating rules. We need to kill some complexity. And the last one is never rest, which means never be happy with the status quo. Always understand that our very best is never going to be quite good enough. Now, these are not just words on a page. In fact, you won't see them, I don't think, hanging on our walls anywhere. You won't see them in 6-foot perspex letters in our lobby. But they are the fundamental framework of how we make decisions, and we talk about it as an executive team all the time. Now, I also take my leadership model and my values as a leader from New Zealand, from my native New Zealand. New Zealand's a small country. As I said, a lot of sheep, but 4.4 million people. We don't have aircraft carriers or submarines, all the paraphernalia of hard power. But in New Zealand, we do know about soft power, how to achieve our goals through influence, through co-opting rather than coercion. And my favourite word, let me tell you about my favourite word in any language. It's a Maori word called mana. And its meaning is impossible to capture in a single English word. It doesn't sort of exist. It's something about earned authority, it's about prestige, it's about courage, and it's about humility. And I'm sure many of you will recall 15 Kiwis who demonstrated some mana in abundance last summer, when they won the Rugby World Cup. I've now mentioned that twice. And one aspect of mana is what the All Blacks call, and you'll have to please excuse my language, but the no dickheads rule. And if you're brave enough to enter their dressing room before a match, you may notice that one of them is sweeping the floor of the dressing room because the team takes it in turns to keep the dressing room clean, to remind them who they're playing for and remind them to be humble. And I think it's the same in leadership of a business, but that sort of thing is mana in action. Because no team wins if they don't play as a team. If individuals play for themselves, then the whole team gets infected by hubris. And it's a trait that's not entirely unknown amongst CEOs. So as CEOs, we all need to guard against this. But ladies and gentlemen, finally, ultimately, as a CEO, I see myself as a steward or a temporary guardian, a guardian of something that's fine, that's something that's my responsibility to grow and develop and strengthen for future generations, to protect for the future. My job, I think, is to learn from the past and all the mistakes both that I've made and the business has made and other businesses have made, but very much look to the future. In fact, it comes really back to the title of my remarks. My real job, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll agree, is to be a good ancestor. And so on that note, thank you, and I think we can open for some Q&A.